glad we're good. Thanks.
Let's try it. I just saw the light go on. Okay, that's a good sign.
Okay, my bad. I'm going to have to do them because they're not. Okay.
I'll just ask you to advance.
They put the other one up.
All right. So what's the name? Start the clock again.
Okay. No, I'll just talk fast. Next slide, please. Today I'm going to start talking about the rationale and composition of the T&E portfolio and some of the key points. Team building. It's a very important process. The T&E teaming is not a natural thing for many of the research topics that universities have for grants. There's a natural tendency to work together. With this portfolio, it's a little bit different. I have people from different organizations, and it's sometimes a challenge to get them to talk to each other and understand what the other is doing. AFRL plays a very important role in this. Both the technical leaders and the PIs working for me, they provide not just the research capability, but the leadership as well in that regard in the team building. Endorsements. Air Force Test Center is very heavily involved in the guidance for the portfolio, what we have, what we're working on. And I have started now to engage them in new topics or things that come in terms of grant proposals, to send those their way and see if they will endorse that topic. And I think that's an important part here for the portfolio. The impact of T&E and the AFOSR BAA, the broad agency announcement. My understanding is for the first time we got T&E announced in the FY13 BAA, and it has been very successful in attracting outside interest. And that outside interest is not just with the universities, faculty interested in the summer fellowship program, young investigator proposal program, and also the lab tasks. The lab people look for information on all of our portfolios, and that's one place that they go to. T&E, and trying to understand that means different things to different people. I have some slides. I'll be talking a little bit more about what those different meanings might be. But in our organization, it is really the science behind test engineering. It's not the systems engineering. It's not the acquisition program management. It is the science. Next slide. Along traditional kind of topic areas for what's in the portfolio, research thrust areas, and there's a lot of overlap. I have 5: sensors and electromagnetics, enabling materials, hypersonics, aero, and data information management and fusion. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the pictures on this slide. They all came from program review last summer. I asked my PIs to provide single summary slides, so I pulled a lot of their images off. And the one I'd really like to focus on is the second row. I have a couple of projects going on that I'd like to talk about right away. The first being some diagnostic capabilities that are being done through a lab task by Dr. Don Dorsey at the RX, the Manufacturing and Materials Directorate. What he's looking at is what happens when micro or nano circuits get damaged. And he's developing those cutting edge tools to assess what's going on. He's actually dissecting the microcircuits and then going through an analysis process and developing methodologies and tools for that. I require my lab PIs to team up with someone at a test center so that they can get the test center's perspective on. And these are the test engineers, okay? And one of the partnerships that's evolved is that AEDC Arnold, and the space calibration chambers and space test chambers, okay, where they test the electronics, and it's not just the cold and the vacuum, it's also radiation environment. So they will sometimes have things that are damaged. They need that diagnostic capability. The lab is providing it. It's a great thing for Don because he has something to work with. He doesn't have to figure out how to break it. And the benefit to the Air Force occurs, of course, up here. We get better electronics that we put in orbit, and we'd certainly like, if they're going to break, we'd like that to happen down here where we can do something about it and understand why. The other half of this row, we've got a project going on with ultra-high performance concrete. This is for the high-speed test track at Holloman, where they test mostly penetrating weapons. And in that regard, you know, we want to give them better materials. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on at the basic research level. You know, we can talk about packing theory, finite element models. We can talk about bonding, hydration, grain boundaries, things like that. All of that science, but ultimately when we take that into the university laboratory, and I don't think that's that shows up very well, it's a university laboratory with a big mixer and a wheelbarrow. Not your typical lab bench science, but that's what the concrete labs do. And the problems that we encounter with the scale-up, it's not as simple to produce the big blocks that Holloman needs. We run into a lot of problems, and that has to do with you know, exothermic processes and the internal heat buildup in the structure. They all have to be reckoned with as part of this process too. And it's not that simple. It's not that easy. The mixing process, uniformity, and knowing that we have what we think we have, because now I can ask what Superman is doing here. We want the weapon to penetrate. We don't want it to bounce off, okay? And to do that, we have to have the best concrete available so that we can test in a realistic environment. But it starts at the basic research level and continues on. Next slide. My word slide, so I'm not going to read any of the words, but this is what T&E maybe means in a portfolio. And the research science involved both at the universities and at AFRL labs. Next slide. What it means to, say, test engineers is very different. You know, this is the test engineering acquisition program, systems engineering and integration slide, but this is what the Air Force, the value that the Air Force gets out of this basic research investment. They all need to mesh and come together. Next slide. And looking at the portfolio, not just the guidance, how I decide what the investment strategy is, but let me start by showing a couple of pie charts. The ones on the far right are 2012, FY12, where I show the breakdown by thrust area, but also by investment type, project type. The portfolio is mostly STTRs, and those are designed for tech transition. I do have a good number of lab tasks, but I have very little core university basic research money in the portfolio, and that is an organizational strategy. It's not my individual preference, but I think it's very effective for this portfolio. On the left, before you get alarmed and say, gee, things have changed a lot in FY13, the reason, let me draw attention to the bottom pie chart, STTR Phase 2. This process, when we began, I think initially back in 2009, and decided to heavily weight at the STTRs and the portfolios, that was a growth process, and we finally are at the end of that growth process. So when you look, the STTR Phase 2 is a much larger component in FY13. It is mature. And the shifting, the reallocation is not because there's been a greater emphasis in a particular area, but rather this is an ongoing process, and through the additional Phase 2 awards, there has been this shift in the areas, and that was expected. For deciding what to do with this portfolio, it is multidisciplinary, and I can't do it alone. I have expert panels that advise me. I've got a slide in that I'll show in a few minutes. But on those advisory panels, they consist mostly of the AFOSR program officers, the S&E from the T&E community, S&E from AFRL, and we also now are placing a greater emphasis on getting endorsements to affect how these things divvy up. Next slide. Now, this is not a simple process. There are building blocks involved because my portfolio goes beyond 6.1 through the STTR process, but also because I engage the laboratory PIs with the test community, everything has to work in this end too. So we have partnering with the laboratory PIs on each of the awards for LRIRs, someone from the test community who's a hands-on engineer who will work with that PI and help discuss the problem that they're trying to solve from the T&E perspective. I also have a officer from AFTC, the Office of Research and Technology Applications, Doug Hoffelt, who is working with me very closely. We communicate frequently, several times a week, email, telephone calls. On the OSD end for some of the stuff over here in the building blocks, the T&E S&T program, George Rumford and some of the executing agents that work for him, they're involved. Of course, the AFRL PIs, once again, let me emphasize not just the technical, but the leadership role that they play in this. I cannot do this process. This process won't work without AFRL. It's everywhere in these building blocks. And we need to make those connections, and the PIs are responsible for that. And finally, AFOSR, T&E, we're down here, so we have a role with the inception and shaping. I think it was called the championing, champion part of it, of the process. But we also serve as a conduit and filter. By conduit, I'm in communication with the other program officers here in our organization. I try to get to their program reviews. I talk to their laboratory PIs and try to get them involved. And I take that to AFTC and the test community, but I also act as a filter because not everything is suitable or appropriate for them. Next slide. The advisory panels, I showed a similar slide last year. The reason I have it up this year is because last year in the spring and summer, this program went through a crisis in terms of not the panels, that was stable, but up here. I had people that were retiring and being transferred, and if you look, the guidance, well, the G is supposed to be there, and the reporting. Guidance and reporting, and that's a critical part, that communication with AFTC, and I was losing those contacts. I worked with Dr. Belk, the executive director at AFTC. He recognized the problem. He took action. He repopulated this upper portion, these upper two blocks, and I will say that as a result, the program is stronger and healthier than ever in that respect. Next slide. Portfolio topic areas. If I go to the 5 traditional topics, they don't work. Okay, so if I put the sorting hat on and come up with really what they mean to the test community, I come up with 3 areas, and here's what they are. Physics-based modeling and simulation for virtual test. And let me delve into that a little bit, because we have 3 main areas where we need the physics-based models. One has to do with the test infrastructure. Okay, these are big, complicated, for ground tests, big, complicated facilities. And the models that can help tell us how to operate those better, how to do a better job with those are important to the test community. We also have the test process itself and the physical models, and now there's an interplay. There's a greater reliance on some of the models rather than traditional test, or sometimes there's a combination of those things for the test process itself. And finally, there's the analysis of the test results. Okay, and understanding those and giving meaning to that test, and that is the evaluation part of T&E, and the models play a role there. Telemetry and wireless power is not a large area of investment, but it's a very important area. When we have for ground tests those big pieces of equipment, the test facilities being operated, that information needs to flow into a control room. We have safety issues and concerns. Can the test proceed? If we take that into flight test, we have both the aircraft and the pilot safety that may be involved. So that information has to get from wherever the test is being conducted to a control room where they're making decisions in real time. And there's where the telemetry comes into play. And this third area, sensors, sources, and enablers. Let me dissect that a little bit, because everyone knows what a sensor is, but I have two different types of sensors that affect my community. One is the sensor that is used for the test, but sometimes the product, if you will, under development that comes in for testing also has sensors. And in cases like that, those sensors sometimes come into the T&E facility to be calibrated, so I need calibration sources. Sometimes they come in for more complicated integrated testing, like hardware in the loop for, say, an infrared focal plane. I need a scene generator, and that's a source. I need to stimulate that sensor in the right way. And finally, the enabler. The enablers are kind of a catch-all, but as an example, the ultra-high performance concrete, that big block, okay, it's not an instrument, it's not a model, but the test can't be conducted without it, and it's a critical part of that process. Next slide. Okay, so in the area of physics-based modeling and simulation, current project areas, and I'm going to highlight the virtual flight models that are under development, but there are several other areas here. I'll probably say a little bit about the high-performance computing, especially as it relates to computational fluid dynamics. Next slide. Now, in the team building process, the PIs play a critical role, and here is a lot of the stuff that's happening in terms of the team constructions for the virtual flight software under development. And, you know, it involves different people, different organizations, all working together. You'll see that I also added some of the things that I mentioned from the BAA that come into play. Summer Faculty Fellowship, SMART, the SMART program, and I'll be showing similar slides for the other two areas later, and there will be the other minor parts that are here, but they're extremely important for building up the T&E infrastructure for this program. I make use of all of these things. Some of the work I'd like to highlight before I move on to that, let me just say that this area is fairly broad because it involves different disciplines and different concerns, validation, different sources of test data for doing that, the different disciplines that I could identify. And I'd like to take just a second to point out that in the area of presentation, publication, all of the people, all the names here are publishing frequently in the journals. They're going to conferences, presenting their work. You know, the research is not limited to just AFRL in this endeavor. All of the people are actively engaged in the research and in the publication process. In particular, Jason Lechniak, who works at Edwards, the test wing. Edwards has not only access to the flight data, but they have an expertise in this area for model development. Jason is working as the tech transition advisor for Dr. Crystal Pasilio at the Munitions Directorate, RW, at Eglin in this regard. And I'll be saying more about this activity shortly. Next slide. Okay, so here's what Dr. Pasilio is working on. It's this complicated problem of flow interaction. It's a combination of a flexible aircraft structure that needs to be modeled. We have, flow around that structure and how that structure interacts with that flow. Okay, you'd think that this would be I've done it once, I've answered everything, but it's not, because what happens when the aircraft is first designed, prototype is put into, the testing, that's all nice and fine, and then someone says, oh, we're going to have all these external stores that we do, and the aircraft gets into the fleet, and throughout its life cycle, these stores are being modified, so this stuff is changing, and what we don't want to have happen, the airplanes aren't supposed to flap like that. No, those things aren't supposed to happen, but it's because of this nonlinear interaction between a structure and a flow. It's a tough problem that she's working on. Now, when we talked about the role, and Jason and some of the people in the group that he works in there are actually getting some of that money to do the technical work. And when we were talking about what else do we need to do, where do we need to invest, what new STTR topics, he said one of the problems that we have is when we compare flight test data for something like this with what our best model gives us, we have differences that we can't explain. We don't know whether those differences have to do with the sensor placement and calibration, whether they're due to variations in the local condition, winds that we don't know about, whether it's the finite element model that needs improvement for the structure, whether it's the computational fluid dynamics model. We don't know what we need to tackle. All we know is that we have a discrepancy. And the flight data won't help us answer that. Next slide. So we crafted a topic where we said, what can we do with phase 1, phase 2, STTR, and thought that maybe we could take it into a wind tunnel test model construction, but bring in some of the modern things into this, and that is additive manufacturing, integrated sensors, and the prize here is not the model, the prize is the data. We put in a requirement that we wanted any of the test data, and that includes the design, to be put into the public domain so that the people doing the model development would have access to that, and the community would be served and the science would be advanced. Next slide. Reduced order models, and Doug Smith, when he was talking about his flow and dynamics, some of the stuff there, he said something very interesting. One of his PIs came up with this formulation where the computational complexity was greatly reduced. Okay, there was a simpler way to get at the answer that didn't require those resources. That's what the reduced order model paradigm is. So we're investing in that area as well. Next slide. Computational efficiency. We can build bigger supercomputers, we can build faster supercomputers, we can build better supercomputers. It's expensive. Some of the performance bottlenecks are with algorithms that were developed for old hardware, 10, 15, 20 years ago, what we may call legacy code, but they're still in use. Those algorithms, we need to identify those bottlenecks and get better performance by finding ways of removing or reducing those bottleneck issues. So we have STTR Phase 2, we actually did 2 awards here. This one specifically looks at the algorithm portion. And next slide. Could I get the next slide? There. It's not just the algorithms and the parceling out to these huge number of processors and cores. If there is an inefficiency in that process, and the worst case would be where all of the other processors are waiting for one thing to finish and that loop isn't converging quickly. So everything is idle. It's a big waste of resource. Each of these 2 areas of investigation, we're seeing not small percentages, we're seeing the potential for speed up a factor of 5 to 10 in some cases. Okay, so this is a big deal for the computational people to get those tools working efficiently and keeping them working efficiently. Next slide. Virtual flight test, we have 2 Phase 2 awards in this area, and for very good reason. The same topic. This one looks at the interaction of the control system and is developing that aspect of flight test modeling. Next slide, please. And the second award is looking at the reduced order models for virtual flight test. How can we come to the computational solutions quickly and efficiently? Next slide. This is a lab task out of the Sensors Directorate, maybe a little bit looking further down the road for hypersonics. What happens with the transmission of electromagnetic radiation through a boundary layer and plasma? And we're not just looking at RF, we're looking at optical signals and anything related to that. And that is Dr. Saba Modalier working with Dr. Charles Jones at Edwards. Next slide. And a related topic, weakly ionized plasmas, but this is a Phase 2 STTR that has just come to completion. Next slide. Radar related research, Dr. Julie Jackson at AFIT working with Eric Branch at Sensors Directorate, RY, teaming up with Gary Jones as the Tech Transition Advisor at the National Radar Test Facility, looking at being able to do feature extraction. And we got a very strong endorsement from Gary Jones out there on this work recently. Next slide. Turbine blade mistuning, I'll only say this is potentially a safety thing. The test community doesn't always get manufacturer's data because it's proprietary or it costs a lot. And when they get something in to test and things just aren't right, when we get into these multiple blade resonances and the testers aren't sure what to do about it, that and whether they can proceed or not, we need to have the models that will answer those questions so that we can conduct the test safely. Next slide. Same topic, we had 2 Phase 1 awards. Next slide. Electromagnetic compatibility. This was a topic of great interest to the folks at Seek Eagle office that are looking at the safety of the electronics involved in weapon systems. When we have RF emitters and they enter, and this is an example, they enter an engine cavity, for instance, they won't necessarily be attenuated, they'll reflect, and sometimes there can be positive reinforcements and sometimes multiple reflections, and those signals in the wrong place will cause induced currents, okay? And if that happens with a circuit board, especially a circuit board that may control ammunition, will that circuit board fail? Will it prematurely activate? That's the kind of problem that we're trying to address with this topic. And it's modeling some very elegant outstanding work is being done in this area. Next slide. Comparing test results. It's not really a modeling problem, but one of the things that the test community is faced with for any kind of test after that aircraft is developed and goes into operation, then it changes and evolves over time. But this is the most comprehensive data they have on aircraft performance. So the operational people will come back to the testers and say, if I do this, will that be okay? And the test community, because they have control of the data, are asked to provide answers for a different aircraft. It's not that prototype that was tested anymore. It's very important to them. Next slide. Okay, let me move on to the wireless power, C-band telemetry in particular. The importance I have already said something about, but the big thing is that the U.S. is selling off bandwidth to commercial interests. And this is really constraining what can be done as far as the telemetry and some of the ranges. So they're turning to C-band, but the C-band is not develop commercial product like some of the, the fobs, the remotes, the cell phones, the Bluetooths. So there's a lot of investment that needs to be made in this area. Next slide. It's not as big an area, but here are some of the working relationships, the teaming, and I'd like to point out the work that's being done by Tony Quach. Next slide. Tony's at the Sensors Directorate, and he has a team of people that are looking at gallium arsenide and developing power amplifiers. That's been the first part of it anyway, using that to have something that is configurable, where I don't have to build another for this purpose or that purpose, where I can have a great deal of control over how it functions, so I can make a lot of them, put them out, and let the users determine how they need to use it and how they're going to adjust it. And he's just, by the way, filed a patent for some of this work. Next slide. This is a different problem with C-band when we get into munitions. Next slide, and I'll just talk about why. Here we have munitions have size requirements. You know, they're small, so it needs to fit into something much smaller if we want to do the telemetry during the test. And in this case, they've added a constraint of less than 2 cubic inches, so we have STTR to do the tech transfer. This looks like it's going to be a real winner. It looks like at the end of phase 2, they're actually going to have a product ready for delivery, several prototypes, and be ready to commercialize. Next slide. Wireless power transmission. I talked about this last year, so I'm not going to delve into it. University, Florida International University, some work being done there on strongly coupled magnetic resonance, where we can transmit power over short distances about that far, maybe 50 to 70% efficiency. And this, in the second year, Professor Georgakopoulos is looking at reducing the size to microcircuit or micro devices. But the key thing for the test community is not the sensor, but the complexity of the wiring involved, the placement in the wiring. If we can do things like this, then it greatly reduces that complexity, and they're very interested in this work. Next slide. And finally, wireless sensors under development. Next slide. Last area is with the instruments, sources, and enablers. I have a few things that I'm going to highlight here. And okay, I still have a few minutes to talk. Some of the instrument development, a good deal of the instrument development has to do with pressure, flow, ablation, and so on. The nanoscale diagnostics I already talked about. Cryodeposit mitigation. In the space test chambers, they're cold under high vacuum, but if they ice up on the optics, when the optical components come in for calibration, they have to warm things back up again. Sometimes they have to break vacuum. It's a big problem when that happens, and I've got a slide I'll talk in greater detail about that. The wind tunnel model I've talked about, so let's go on to the next slide, and I'll try to use my time wisely here. Some of the relationships, and I'd like to point out, this is the first time that Durits have shown up, okay? The infrastructure to bring, world-class equipment into the university laboratories that we purchase but are in the interest of the Air Force because they're funded projects that are in the portfolio. And we have now several DURIPs that are under consideration. I don't think they've been awarded or we've heard an announcement yet. But 3 of the PIs that are functioning in, I think, some pretty well-developed teams. I have another PI over here who is not being funded through me, and that will happen from time to time. Those collaborations are important. Next slide. Neuromorphic computing, and I heard the term earlier, non-traditional computing or non-conventional. This neuromorphic computing is about a mix of analog with digital circuits, but at the logic level. So these things are being built at foundries. And they're putting together, this team at the Information Directorate, headed by Claire Thiem, is putting together these things on massive scale where tens of thousands of neurons are interlaced with the computers. But they also have these things that are being done on the individual chip level, what I will call a solid-state neural device. And that is leading to maybe some really interesting development. The team, we have a photograph of them over here. They just received an annual RI Team Award for this work. They received the individual award, Dr. Wysocki, an individual award, and that went up to AFRL corporate, and it was just announced he won the individual corporate level. And in addition to the outstanding work that this team has done, I'm really glad that they're getting a recognition from the organization. So this solid-state neural device, I've got a couple of pictures here. What might we do with it? Why might it be important to the test community? Next slide. We have a wind tunnel control system that is based on a neural net design. This was installed at the University of Notre Dame wind tunnel successfully. And now the 2 teams are collaborating, and at the Information Directorate, they hope to train one of these neural nets on a chip to provide the same function. And we see, because the control systems for some of these big facilities are old, they don't get upgraded very often, we see a lot of potential to take them into not just wind tunnels, but some of the other things that involve heat exchangers and flow. Next slide. I already talked about what Don Dorsey was doing for the diagnostics. Next slide. Cryodeposit mitigation, I said I'd mention that briefly. 3 components. We need to be able to measure the cryodeposit. So there's a monitor under development. We'd like to be able to mitigate. We don't think we're probably going to do much in that area. And finally, remediation. Can we remove the ice? Now that we know it's there and where it is, can we remove that without having to warm things up and break vacuum? Next slide. Same topic. Next slide. Some work being done for advanced sensor development for new generation hypersonic test capability that the Air Force is considering. Next slide. Workforce development, that is my sole grant, my sole big grant anyway. And this is a non-traditional grant because we're not funding necessarily the research at the research professor level. Our focus is on students and developing the next generation hypersonic researcher for the DoD and government in general. This program's been going on for a long enough period of time. We've had people transition, and we have had 3 students graduate and have all taken government positions. Next slide. Concrete again, so we'll go on. Next slide. We had 3 Phase 1 awards. Next slide. Next slide. And a couple of sensors under development for hypersonics. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. That was the transonic fighter. Next slide. And I'm done. But before I finish, I still have, I told you I haven't run down the shot clock. I still have a minute. Because the portfolio has this constant turnover through the STTR process, I wanted to make sure that you were aware of some new awards. This is already in the portfolio, and 6 new topics we're really excited about. But finally, I have a lab task that is just the right thing. It's a pre-existing team of people working together. Dr. Dan Brown at RQR, Edwards working on Hall plasma thrusters. They have a big problem with testing those and getting reliable information at AEDC for space operation. And he is tackling that by constructing a model, but he has ties to AFIT, where they have a space experiment in play, and he's gotten a strong endorsement from SMC. Next slide. And I'm done. Thank you. And I have 20 seconds. Do I have 15 seconds for questions?
15 seconds for questions. No questions during the transition? We have one question while we transition.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could share some of these techniques for removing crowds and comments. Or would it be best just to visit those charts later?
How about during the break?
Yeah, I think during the break I'll be glad to discuss those with you and your government, so I can send you copies of reports.
Thank you, Mike. All right, next up we have Dr.